The war with Rome begins not with a clang of swords, but with the lick of a dagger drawn from an assassin's cloak. Festival season. In Jerusalem, the time when Jews from across the Mediterranean converge upon the holy city bearing fragrant offerings to God. There are in the ancient Jewish religion a host of annual observances and celebrations that can only be performed here, inside the Temple of Jerusalem, in the presence of the high priest, who hoards the most sacred feast, days Passover, Pentecost, the harvest festival of Sukkot, all the while pocketing a healthy, or tithe, as he would call it, for his trouble. And what trouble it is. On such days, the city's population can swell to more than 1 million people. It takes the full force of the porters and lower priests to squeeze the crush of pilgrims through the Hulda, gates at the temple's southern wall. 2 herd them along the dark and cavernous galleries beneath the temple plaza and guide them up the double flight of stairs that lead to the public square and marketplace known as the Court of Gentiles. The Temple of Jerusalem is a roughly rectangular structure, some 500 meters long and 300 meters wide, balanced atop Mount Moriah on the eastern edge of the Holy City. Its outer walls are rimmed with covered porticos, whose slab-topped roofs, held up by row after row of glittering white stone columns, protect the masses from the merciless sun. On the Temple's southern flank sits the largest and most ornate of the porticos. The royal portico, a tall 2-story basilica-like assembly hall built in the customary Roman style. This is the administrative quarters of the Sanhedrin, the supreme religious body and highest judicial court of the Jewish nation. It is also where a clatter of merchants and grubby money changers lie in wait. As you make your way up the underground stairs and onto the spacious sunlit plaza, the money changers play a vital role in the temple. For a fee, they will exchange your foul foreign coins for the Hebrew shekel, the only currency permitted by the temple authorities. The money changers will also collect the half-shekel temple tax that all adult males must pay to preserve the pomp and spectacle of all you see around you. The mountains of burning incense and the ceaseless sacrifices, the wine libations and the first fruits offering, the Levite choir belting out psalms of praise, and the accompanying orchestra thrumming lyres and banging cymbals. Someone must pay for these necessities. Someone must bear the cost of the burnt offerings that so pleased the Lord. With the new currency in hand, you are now free to peruse the pens lining the periphery walls to purchase your sacrifice. A pigeon, a sheepit, depends on the depth of your purse or the depth of your sins. If the latter transcends the former, do not despair. The money changers are happy to offer the credit you need to enhance your sacrifice. There is a strict legal code regulating the animals that can be purchased for the blessed occasion. They must be free of blemish, domesticated, not wild. They cannot be beasts of burden. Whether ox or bull or ram or sheep, they must have been reared for this purpose alone. They are not cheap. Why should they be? The sacrifice is the temple's primary purpose. It is the very reason for the temple's being. The songs, the prayers, the readings, every ritual that takes place here arose in service of this singular and most vital ritual. The blood libation not only wipes away your sins, it cleanses the earth. It feeds the earth, renewing and sustaining it, protecting us all from drought or famine or worse. The cycle of life and death that the Lord in His omnificence has decreed is wholly dependent upon your sacrifice. This is not the time for thrift. So purchase your offering and make it a good one. Pass it on to any of the white-robed priests roaming the temple plaza. They are the descendants of Aaron, the brother of Moses, responsible for maintaining the temple's daily rites. The burning of incense, the lighting of lamps, the sounding of trumpets, and, of course, the sacrificial offerings. The priesthood is a hereditary position, but there is no shortage of them, certainly not during festival season. When they arrive in droves from distant lands to assist in the festivities, they cram the temple in 24-hour shifts to ensure that the fires of sacrifice are kept aflame day and night. The temple is constructed as a series of tiered courtyards, each smaller, more elevated, and more restrictive than the last. The outermost courtyard, the Court of Gentiles, where you purchased your sacrifice, is a broad piazza open to everyone, regardless of race or religion. If you are a Jew, free of any physical immixtion, no lepers, no paralytics, and properly purified by a ritual bath you may follow the priest with your offering through a stone lattice fence and proceed into the next courtyard. The court of women, a plaque on the fence, warns all others to proceed no farther than the outer court on pain of death. Here is where the wood and oil for the sacrifices are stored. It is also the farthest into the temple that any Jewish woman may proceed. Jewish men may continue up a small semicircular flight of stairs through the Nicanor gate and into the court of Israelites. This is as close as you will ever be to the presence of God. The stink of carnage is impossible to ignore. It clings to the skin, the hair, becoming a noisome burden you'll not soon shake off. The priests burn incense to ward off the fever and disease, but the mixture of myrrh and cinnamon, saffron, and frankincense cannot mask the insufferable stench of slaughter. Still, it is important to stay where you are and witness your sacrifice take place in the next courtyard, the court of priests. Entry into this court is permitted solely to the priests and temple OCLs, for this is where the temple's altar stands. A four-horned pedestal made of bronze and wood 5 cubits long, 5 cubits wide, belching thick, black clouds of smoke into the air. The priest takes your sacrifice to a corner and cleanses himself in a nearby basin. Then, with a simple prayer, he slits the animal's throat. An assistant collects the blood in a bowl to sprinkle on the four-horned corners of the altar, while the priest carefully disembowels and dismembers the carcass. The animal's hide is his to keep. It'll fetch a handsome price. In the marketplace, the entrails and the fatty tissue are torn out of the corpse, carried up a ramp to the altar, and placed directly atop the eternal fire. The meat of the beast is carved away carefully and put to the side for the priests to feast upon after the ceremony. The entire liturgy is performed in front of the temple's innermost court, the Holy of Holies, a gold-plated columnar sanctuary at the very heart of the temple complex. Holy of Holies is the highest point in all Jerusalem. Its doors are draped in purple and scarlet tapestries embroidered with a zodiac wheel and a panorama of the heavens. This is where the glory of God physically dwells. It is the meeting point between the earthly and heavenly realms, the center of all creation. The Ark of the Covenant containing the commandments of God once stood here, but that was lost long ago. There is now nothing inside the sanctuary. It is a vast, empty space that serves as a conduit for the presence of God, channeling His divine spirit from the heavens, flowing it out in concentric waves across the temple's chambers, through the court of priests and the court of Israelites, the court of women and the court of Gentiles, over the temple's porticoed walls and down into the city of Jerusalem, across the Judean countryside to Samaria and Idumea, Perea and Galilee, through the boundless empire of mighty Rome, and on to the rest of the world, to all peoples and nations, all of them Jew and Gentile alike nourished and sustained by the Spirit of the Lord of creation, a spirit that has one soul, source, and no other. The inner sanctuary, the Holy of Holies, tucked within the temple in the sacred city of Jerusalem. Entrance to the Holy of Holies is barred to all save the high priest, who at this time, 56 before Christ, is a young man named Jonathan, son of Anan. Like most of his recent predecessors, Jonathan purchased his say directly from Rome, and for a hefty price, no doubt. TOC of high priest is a lucrative one, limited to a handful of noble families who pass the position between them like a legacy. The lower priests generally come from more modest backgrounds. The role of the temple in Jewish life cannot be overstated. The temple serves as calendar and clock for the Jews. Its rituals mark the cycle of the year and shape the day-to-day activities of every inhabitant of Jerusalem. It is the center of commerce for all Judea, its chief financial institution and largest bank. The temple is as much the dwelling place of Israel's God as it is the seat of Israel's nationalist aspirations. It not only houses the sacred writings and scrolls of law that maintain the Jewish religion, it is the main repository for the legal documents, historical notes, and genealogical records of the Jewish nation. Unlike their heathen neighbors, the Jews do not have a multiplicity of temples scattered across the land. There is only one cultic center, one unique source for the divine presence, one singular place and no other where a Jew can commune with the living God. Judea is For all intents and purposes, a temple state. The very term theocracy was coined specifically to describe Jerusalem. Some people have entrusted the supreme political powers to monarchies, wrote the first-century Jewish historian Flavius Josephus, others to oligarchies, yet others to the Messiah. Our lawgiver, however, was attracted by none of these forms of polity, but gave to his constitution the form of what, if a forced expression be permitted, may be termed a theocracy, placing all sovereignty and authority in the hands of God, who killed Jonathan son of Ananas as he strode across the Temple Mount in the year 56 before Christ. No doubt there were many in Jerusalem who longed to slay the rapacious high priest, and more than a few who would have liked to wipe out the bloated temple priesthood in its entirety. For what must never be forgotten when speaking of first-century Palestine is that this land, this hallowed land from which the Spirit of God flowed to the rest of the world, was occupied territory. Legions of Roman troops were stationed throughout Judea. Some 600 Roman soldiers resided atop the Temple Mount itself, within the high stone walls of the Antonia fortress, which buttressed the northwest corner of the temple wall. The unclean centurion in his red cape and polished cuirass, who paraded through the court of Gentiles, his hand hovering over the hilt of his sword, was a not-so-subtle reminder, if any were needed, of who really ruled this sacred place. Roman dominion over Jerusalem began in 63 B. before Christ, when Rome's master tactician, Pompey Magnus, entered the city with his conquering legions and laid siege to the temple. By then, Jerusalem had long since passed its economic and cultural zenith. The Canaanite settlement that King David had recast into the seat of his kingdom, the city. He had passed to his wayward son, Solomon, who built the first temple to God, sacked and destroyed by the Babylonians in 586 B. The city that had served as the religious, economic, and political capital of the Jewish nation for 1,000 years was, by the time Pompey strode through its gates, recognized less for its beauty and grandeur than for the religious fervor of its troublesome population. Situated on the southern plateau of the shaggy Judean mountains, between the twin peaks of Mount Scopus and the Mount of Olives, and flanked by the Kidron Valley in the east and the steep, forbidding valley of Gehenna in the south, Jerusalem, at the time of the Roman invasion, was home to a settled population of about 100,000 people. To the Romans, it was an inconsequential speck on the imperial map, a city the wordy statesman Cicero dismissed as a hole in the corner. But to the Jews, this was the navel of the world, the axis of the universe. There was no city more unique, more holy, more venerable in all the world than Jerusalem. The purple vineyards, whose vines twisted and crawled across the level plains, the well-tilled fields and viridescent orchards, bursting with almond and fig and olive trees, the green beds of papyrus, floating lazily along the Jordan rivulet. Jews not only knew and deeply loved every feature of this consecrated land, they laid claim to all of it. Everything from the farmsteads of Galilee to the low-lying hills of Samaria and the far outskirts of Idumea, where the Bible says, the accursed cities of Sodom and Gomorrah once stood, was given by God to the Jews, though in fact the Jews ruled none of it, not even Jerusalem, where the true God was worshipped, the city that the Lord had clothed in splendor and glory and placed, as the prophet Ezekiel declared, in the center of all nations, the eternal seat of God's kingdom on earth, at the dawn of the 1st century before Christ. Just a minor province, and a vexing one at that, at the far corner of the mighty Roman Empire. It is not that Jerusalem was unaccustomed to invasion and occupation, despite its exalted status in the hearts of the Jews. The truth is that Jerusalem was little more than a trifle to be passed among a succession of kings and emperors who took turns plundering and despoiling the sacred city on their way to far grander ambitions. In 586, before Christ, the Babylonians, masters of Mesopotamia, rampaged through Judea, razing both Jerusalem and its temple to the ground. The Babylonians were conquered by the Persians, who allowed the Jews to return to their beloved city and rebuild their temple, not because they admired the Jews or took their religion seriously, but because they considered Jerusalem an irrelevant backwater of little interest or concern to an empire that stretched the length of Central Asia. Though the prophet Isaiah would thank the Persian king Cyrus by anointing him Messiah, the Persian Empire, and Jerusalem with it, fell to the armies of Alexander the Great, whose descendants imbued the city and its inhabitants with Greek culture and ideas. Upon Alexander's untimely death in 323 before Christ, Jerusalem was passed as spoils to the Ptolemaic dynasty and ruled from distant Egypt, though only briefly. In 198 before Christ, the city was wrested from Ptolemaic control by the Seleucid king Antiochus the Great, whose son Antiochus Epiphanes fancied himself God incarnate and strove to put an end, once and for all, to the worship of the Jewish deity, Jerusalem. But the Jews responded to this blasphemy with a relentless guerrilla war. Led by the stout-hearted sons of Mattathias, the Maccabees reclaimed the Holy City from Seleucid control in 164 before Christ, and, for the first time in 4 centuries, restored Jewish hegemony over Judea. For the next 100 years, the Hasmoneans ruled God's land with an iron fist. They were priest-kings, each sovereign serving as both king of the Jews and high priest of the temple. But when civil war broke out between the brothers Hyrcanus and Aristobulus over control of the throne, each brother foolishly reached out to Rome for support. Pompey took the brothers' entreaties as an invitation to seize Jerusalem for himself, thus putting an end to the brief period of direct Jewish rule over the city of God. In 63 before Christ, Judea became a Roman protectorate, and the Jews were made once again a subject people. Roman rule, coming as it did after a century of independence, was not warmly received by the Jews. The Hasmonean dynasty was abolished, but Pompey allowed Hyrcanus to maintain the position of high priest. That did not sit well with the supporters of Aristobulus, who launched a series of revolts to which the Romans responded with characteristic savagery, burning towns, massacring rebels, enslaving populations. While the chasm between the starving and indebted poor toiling in the countryside and the wealthy provincial class ruling in Jerusalem grew even wider. It was standard Roman policy to forge alliances with the landed aristocracy in every captured city, making them dependent on the Roman overlords for their power and wealth. By aligning their interests with those of the ruling class, Rome ensured that local leaders remained wholly vested in maintaining the imperial system. Of course, in Jerusalem, landed aristocracy more or less meant the priestly class, and specifically, that handful of wealthy, priestly families who maintained the temple and who, as a result, were charged by Rome with collecting the taxes and tribute and keeping order among the increasingly restive population tasks for which they were richly compensated. The fluidity that existed in Jerusalem between the religious and political powers made it necessary for Rome to maintain close supervision over the Jewish cult and, in particular, over the high priest. As head of the Sanhedrin and leader of the nation, the high priest was a figure of both religious and political, renowned with the power to decide all religious matters, to enforce God's law, and even to make arrests, though only in the vicinity of the temple. If the Romans wanted to control the Jews, they had to control the temple, and if they wanted to control the temple, they had to control the high priest, which is why, soon after taking control over Judea, Rome took upon itself the responsibility of appointing and deposing either directly or indirectly the high priest, essentially transforming him into a Roman employee. Rome even kept custody of the high priest's sacred garments, handing them out only on the sacred festivals and feast days and confiscating them immediately after the ceremonies were complete. Still, the Jews were better off than some other Roman subjects. For the most part, the Romans humored the Jews, allowing them to conduct their rituals and sacrifices without interference. The Jews were even excused from the direct worship of the emperor, which Rome imposed upon nearly every other religious community under its dominion. All that Rome asked of Jerusalem was a twice-daily sacrifice of 1 bull and 2 lambs on behalf of the emperor and for his good health. Continue making the sacrifice, keep up with the taxes and tribute, follow the provincial laws, and Rome was happy to leave you, your God, and your temple alone. The Romans were, after all, fairly proficient in the religious beliefs and practices of subject peoples. Most of the lands they conquered were allowed to maintain their temples unmolested. Rival gods, far from being vanquished or destroyed, were often assimilated into the Roman cult. That is how, for example, the Canaanite god Baal became associated with the Roman god Saturn. In some cases, under a practice called evocatio, the Romans would take possession of an enemy's temple land, therefore its god, for the two were inextricable in the ancient world, and transfer it to Rome, where it would be showered with riches and lavish. Such displays were meant to send a clear signal that the hostilities were directed not toward the enemy's god but toward its fighters. The god would continue to be honored and worshipped in Rome if only his devotees would lay down their arms and allow themselves to be absorbed into the empire. As generally tolerant as the Romans may have been when it came to foreign cults, they were even more lenient toward the Jews and their fealty to their one god. Cicero decried as the barbarian superstitions of Jewish monotheism. The Romans may not have understood the Jewish religion, with its strange observances and its overwhelming obsession with ritual purity. The Jews regard as profane all that we hold sacred, Tacitus wrote, while they permit all that we abhor. But they nevertheless tolerated it. What most puzzled Rome about the Jews was not their unfamiliar rites or their strict devotion to their laws, but rather what the Romans considered to be their unfathomable sense of superiority. The notion that an insignificant Semitic tribe residing in a distant corner of the mighty Roman Empire demanded, and indeed received, special treatment from the emperor was, for many Romans, simply incomprehensible. How dare they consider their god to be the sole god in the universe? How dare they keep themselves separate from all other nations? Who do these backward and superstitious tribesmen think they are? The Stoic philosopher Seneca was not alone among the Roman elite in wondering how it had possibly come to pass in Jerusalem that the vanquished have given laws to the victors. What the Romans could not understand was that this Jewish exceptionalism was not a matter of arrogance or pride. It was a direct commandment from a jealous God who tolerated no foreign presence in the land he had set aside for his chosen people. Is why, when the Jews first came to this land 1,000 years earlier, God had decreed that they massacre every man, woman, and child they encountered, that they slaughter every ox, goat, and sheep they came across, that they burn every farm, every field, every crop, every living thing without exception, so as to ensure that the land would belong solely to those who worshipped this one God and no other. As for the towns of these people that the Lord your God is giving you as an inheritance, God told the Israelites, you must not let anything that breathes remain alive. You shall annihilate them, all the Hittites and the Amorites, the Canaanites and the Perizzites, the Hivites and the Jebusites just as the Lord your God has commanded. It was, the Bible claims, only after the Jewish armies had utterly destroyed all that breathed. In the cities of Libnah and Lake, and Eglon, and Hebron, and Debir, in the hill country, and in the Negev, in the lowlands, and in the slopes only after every single previous inhabitant of this land was eradicated. As the Lord God of Israel had commanded that the Jews were allowed to settle here, and yet 1,000 years later, this same tribe that had shed so much blood to cleanse the promised land of every foreign element, so as to rule it in the name of its God, now found itself laboring under the boot of an imperial pagan power, forced to share the holy city with Gauls, Spaniards, Romans, Greeks, and Syrians, all of them foreigners, all of them heathens obligated by law to make sacrifices in God's own temple on behalf of a Roman idolater who lived more than 1,000 kilometers away. How would the heroes of old respond to such humiliation and degradation? What would Joshua or Aaron or Phinehas or Samuel do to the unbelievers who had defiled the land set aside by God for his chosen people? They would drown the land in blood. They would smash the heads of the heathens and the Gentiles, burn their idols to the ground, slaughter their wives and their children. They would slay the idolaters and bathe their feet in the blood of their enemies, just as the Lord commanded. They would call upon the God of Israel to burst forth from the heavens in his war chariot, to trample upon the sinful nations and make the mountains writhe at his fury. As for the high priest, the wretch who betrayed God's chosen people to roam for some coin and the right to prance about in his spangled garments, his very existence was an insult to God. It was a blight upon the entire land. It had to be wiped away. In the years of tumult that followed the Roman occupation of Judea, as Rome became enmeshed in a debilitating civil war between Pompey Magnus and his erstwhile ally Julius Caesar, even while remnants of the Hasmonean dynasty continued vying for the favors of both men, the situation for the Jewish farmers and peasants who harrowed and sowed God's land steadily worsened. The small family farms that for centuries had served as the primary basis of the rural economy were gradually swallowed up by large estates, administered by landed aristocracies flush with freshly minted Roman coins. Rapid urbanization under Roman rule fueled mass internal migration from the countryside to the cities. The agriculture that had once sustained the meager village populations was now almost wholly focused on feeding the engorged urban centers, leaving the rural peasants hungry and destitute. The peasantry were not only obligated to continue paying their taxes and their tithes to the temple priesthood, they were now forced to pay a heavy tribute to Rome. For farmers, the total could amount to nearly half their annual yield. At the same time, successive droughts had left large swaths of the countryside fallow and in ruin as much of the Jewish peasantry was reduced to slavery. Those who managed to remain on their wasted fields often had no choice but to borrow heavily from the landed aristocracy at exorbitant interest rates. Never mind that Jewish law forbade the charging of interest on loans. The massive fines that were levied on the poor for late payments had basically the same effect. In any case, the landed aristocracy expected the peasants to default on their loans. They were banking on it. For if the loan was not promptly and fully repaid, the peasant's land could be confiscated, and the peasant kept on the farm as a tenant toiling on behalf of its new owner. Within a few years after the Roman conquest of Jerusalem, an entire crop of landless peasants found themselves stripped of their property with no way to feed themselves or their families. Many of these peasants immigrated to the cities to find work, but in Galilee, a handful of displaced farmers and landowners exchanged their plows for swords and began fighting back against those they deemed responsible for their woes. From their hiding places in the caves and grottos of the Galilean countryside, these peasant warriors launched a wave of attacks against the Jewish aristocracy and the agents of the Roman Republic. They roamed through the provinces, gathering to themselves those in distress, those who were dispossessed and mired in debt. Like Jewish Robin Hoods, they robbed the rich and, on occasion, gave to the poor. To the faithful, these peasant gangs were nothing less than the physical embodiment of the anger and suffering of the poor. They were heroes, symbols of righteous zeal against Roman aggression, dispensers of divine justice to the traitorous Jews. The Romans had a different word for them. They called them lesti, bandits. Bandit was the generic term for any rebel or insurrectionist who rose up against Rome or its Jewish collaborators. To some, the word bandit was synonymous with thief or rabble-rouser. But these were no common criminals. The bandits represented the first stirrings of what would become a nationalist resistance movement against the Roman occupation. This may have been a peasant revolt. The bandit gangs hailed from impoverished villages like Emos, Bethorin, and Bethlehem. But it was something else, too. The bandits claimed to be agents of God. Isse retribution. They cloaked their leaders in the emblems of biblical kings and heroes and presented their actions as a prelude for the restoration of God's kingdom on earth. The bandits tapped into the widespread apocalyptic expectation that had gripped the Jews of Palestine in the wake of the Roman invasion. One of the most fearsome of all the bandits, the charismatic bandit chief Hezekiah, openly declared himself to be the Messiah, the promised one who would restore the Jews to glory. Messiah means anointed one. The title alludes to the practice of pouring or smearing oil on someone charged with divine office. A king, like Saul, or David, or Solomon. A priest, like Aaron and his sons, who were consecrated to do God's work. A prophet, like Isaiah or Elisha, who bore a special relationship with God. An intimacy that comes with being designated God's representative on earth. The Messiah was popularly believed to be the descendant of King David, and so his principal task was to rebuild David's kingdom and re-establish the nation of Israel. Thus, to call oneself the Messiah at the time of the Roman occupation was tantamount to declaring war on Rome. Indeed, the day would come when these angry bands of peasant gangs would form the backbone of an army of zealous revolutionaries. They would force the Romans to flee Jerusalem in humiliation. In those early years of the occupation, however, The bandits were little more than a nuisance. Still, they needed to be stopped. Someone had to restore order in the countryside. That someone turned out to be a clever young Jewish nobleman from Idumea named Herod. Herod's father, Antipater, had the good fortune of being on the right side in the civil war between Pompey Magnus and Julius Caesar. Caesar rewarded Antipater for his loyalty by granting him Roman citizenship in 48 before Christ and giving him administrative powers on behalf of Rome over all of Judea. Before his death, a few years later, Antipater cemented his position among the Jews by appointing his sons Phasael and Herod as governors over Jerusalem and Galilee, respectively. Herod was probably only 15 years old at the time, but he immediately distinguished himself as an effective leader and energetic supporter of Rome by launching a bloody crusade against the bandit gangs. He even captured the bandit chief Hezekiah and cut off his head, putting an end temporarily to the bandit menace. While Herod was clearing Galilee of the bandit gangs, Antigonus, the son of Ariston, who had lost the throne and the high priesthood to his brother Hyrcanus after the Roman invasion, was stirring up trouble in Jerusalem. With the help of Rome's avowed enemies, Antigonus besieged the holy city in 40 before Christ, taking both the high priest Hyrcanus and Herod's brother Phasael prisoner. Hyrcanus was mutilated, rendering him ineligible, according to Jewish law, to serve any longer as high priest. Herod's brother, Phasael, committed suicide while in captivity. The Roman Senate determined that the most effective way to retake Jerusalem from Parthian control was to make Herod its client king, and let him accomplish the task on Rome's behalf. The naming of client kings was standard practice during the early years of the Roman Empire, allowing Rome to expand its borders without expending valuable resources administering conquered provinces directly. In 37 before Christ, Herod marched to Jerusalem with a massive Roman army under his command. He expelled the Parthian forces from the city and wiped out the remnants of the Hasmonean dynasty. In recognition of his services, Rome named Herod king of the Jews, granting him a kingdom that would ultimately grow larger than that of King Solomon. Herod's was a profligate and tyrannical rule marked by farcical excess and bestial acts of cruelty. He was ruthless to his enemies and tolerated no hint of revolt from the Jews under his reign. Upon ascending the throne, he massacred nearly every member of the Sanhedrin and replaced the temple priests with a claque of fawning admirers, purchased their positions directly from him. This act effectively neutered the political influence of the temple and redistributed power to a new class of Jews, whose reliance on the favors of the king transformed them into a sort of nouveau rich aristocracy. Herod's penchant for violence and his highly publicized domestic disputes, which bordered on the burlesque, led him to execute so many members of his own family that Caesar Augustus once famously quipped, "I would rather be Herod's pig than his son." In truth, being king of the Jews in Herod's time was no enviable task. There were, according to Josephus, 24 fractious Jewish sects in and around Jerusalem. Although none enjoyed unfettered dominance over the others, 3 sects, or rather schools, were particularly influential in shaping Jewish thought at the time. The Pharisees, who were primarily lower and middle class, rabbis and scholars who interpreted the laws for the Messiah, the Sadducees, more conservative and, with regard to Rome, more accommodating priests from wealthier landowning families, and the Essenes, a predominantly priestly movement that separated itself from the authority of the temple and made its base on a barren hilltop in the Dead Sea Valley called Qumran, charged with pacifying and administrating an unruly and heterogeneous population of Jews, Greeks, Samaritans, Syrians, and Arabs, all of whom hated him more than they hated each other. Did a masterful job of maintaining order on behalf of Rome. His reign ushered in an era of political stability among the Jews that had not been seen for centuries. He initiated a monumental building and public works project that employed tens of thousands of peasants and day laborers, permanently changing the physical landscape of Jerusalem. He built markets and theaters, palaces and ports, all modeled on the classical Hellenic style. To pay for his colossal construction projects and to satisfy his own extravagance, Herod imposed a crushing tax rate upon his subjects, from which he continued to dispatch a hefty tribute to Rome, and with pleasure, as an expression of his esteem for his Roman masters. Herod was not just the emperor's client king. He was a close and personal friend, a loyal citizen of the Republic who wanted more than to emulate Rome. He wanted to remake it in the sands of Judea. He instituted a forced Hellenization program upon the Jews, bringing gymnasia, Greek amphitheaters, and Roman baths to Jerusalem. He made Greek the language of his court, and minted coins bearing Greek letters and pagan insignia. Yet Herod was also a Jew, and as such he understood the importance of appealing to the religious sensibilities of his subjects. That is why he embarked on his most ambitious project, the rebuilding and expansion of the Temple of Jerusalem. It was Herod who had the temple raised on a platform atop Mount Moriah, the highest point in the city, and embellished with wide Roman colonnades and towering marble columns that gleamed in the sun. Herod's temple was meant to impress his patrons in Rome, but he also wanted to please his fellow Jews, many of whom did not consider the king of the Jews to be himself a Jew. Herod was a convert. After all, his mother was an Ara. His people, the Idumeans, had come to Judaism only a generation or two earlier. The rebuilding of the temple was, for Herod, not only a means of solidifying his political dominance, it was a desperate plea for acceptance by his Jewish subjects. It did not work. Despite the rebuilding of the temple, Herod's unabashed Hellenism and his aggressive attempts to reign Jerusalem enraged pious Jews who seemed never to have ceased viewing their king as a slave to foreign masters and a devotee of foreign gods. Not even the temple, the supreme symbol of Jewish identity, could mask Herod's infatuation with Rome. Shortly before its completion, Herod placed a golden eagle, the sign of Roman dominion, over its main portal and forced his hand-picked high priest to offer 2 sacrifices a day on behalf of Caesar Augustus as the Son of God. Nevertheless, it is a sign of how firmly Herod held his kingdom in his grip that the general odium of the Jews toward his reign never rose to the level of insurrection, at least not in his lifetime. When Herod the Great died in 4b, before Christ, Augustus split his realm among his 3 sons. Archelaus was given Judea, Samaria, and Edom. Herod Antipas, known as the Fox, reigned over Galilee and Perea, a region in the Transjordan northeast of the Indus. Philip was handed control over Gaulonitis and the lands northeast of the Sea of Galilee. None of Herod's 3 sons were given the title of king. Antipas and Philip were each named Tetrarch, meaning ruler of a quarter, and Archelaus was named Ethnarch, or ruler of a people. Both titles were deliberately meant to signal the end of unified kingship over the Jews. The division of Herod's kingdom proved a disaster for Rome, as the dam of anger and resentment that had been built during his long and oppressive reign burst into a flood of riots and violent protests that his nebbish sons, dulled by a life of idleness and languor, could hardly contain. The rioters burned down one of Herod's palaces on the Jordan River. Twice, the temple itself was overrun. First, during Passover, then again at Shavuot, or the Festival of Weeks. In the countryside, the bandit gangs that Herod had beaten into submission once again began tearing through Galilee, slaughtering the former king's associates. In Idumea, Herod's home region, 2,000 of his soldiers, even Herod's allies, including his own cousin Ashiab, joined the rebellion. These uprisings were no doubt fueled by the messianic expectations of the Jews. In Perea, a former slave of Herod's imposing giant of a man named Simon crowned himself Messiah and rallied together a group of bandits to plunder the royal palaces at Jericho. The rebellion ended when Simon was captured and beheaded. A short while later, another messianic aspirant, a poor shepherd boy named Athronges, placed a crown upon his head and launched a foolhardy attack against Roman forces. He, too, was caught and executed. The chaos and bloodshed continued unabated until Caesar Augustus finally ordered his own troops into Judea to put an end to the uprising. Although the emperor allowed Philip and Antipas to remain in their posts, he sent Archelaus into exile, placed Jerusalem under a Roman governor, and, in the year 6 before Christ, transformed all of Judea into a province ruled directly by Rome. There would be no more some independence, no more Cleon, no more king of the Jews. Jerusalem now belonged wholly to Rome. According to tradition, Herod the Great died on the eve of Passover and before Christ. At the ripe age of 70, having reigned over the Jews for 37 years, Josephus writes that on the day of Herod's death, there was an eclipse of the moon, an inauspicious sign, perhaps presaging the tumult that would follow. There is, of course, another tradition told about the demise of Herod the Great, that sometime between his death in 4 before Christ and the Roman takeover of Judea in 6 before Christ, in an obscure hillside village in Galilee, a child was born who would one day claim for himself Herod's mantle as king of the Jews. Ancient Nazareth rests on the jagged brow of a windy hilltop in Lower Galilee. No more than 100 Jewish families live in this tiny village. There are no roads, no public buildings. There's no synagogue. The villagers share a single well from which to draw fresh water, a single bath fed by a trickle of rainfall, captured and stored in underground cisterns, serves the entire population. It is a village of mostly illiterate peasants, farmers, and day laborers, a place that does not exist on any map. The homes in Nazareth are simple affairs. A single windowless room, divided in two, one room for the family, the other for the livestock, made of whitewashed mud and stone and crowned with a flat-topped roof, where the householders gather to pray, where they lay out their wash to dry, where they take their meals on temperate evenings, and where, in the hot summer months, they roll out their dusty mats and sleep. The lucky inhabitants have a courtyard and a tiny patch of soil to grow vegetables, for no matter their occupation or skill, every Nazarene is a farmer. The peasants who call this secluded village home are, without exception, cultivators of the land. It is agriculture that feeds and sustains the meager population. Everyone raises their own livestock. Everyone plants their own crops. A bit of barley, some wheat, a few stalks of millet and oats. The manure collected from the animals feeds the earth, which in turn feeds the villagers, who then feed the livestock. Self-sufficiency is the rule. The hillside hamlet of Nazareth is so small, so obscure, that its name does not appear in any ancient Jewish source before the 3rd century before Christ. Not in the Hebrew Bible, not in the Talmud, not in the Midrash, not in Josephus. It is, in short, an inconsequential and utterly forgettable place. It is also the city in which Jesus was likely born and raised. That he came from this tightly enclosed village of a few hundred impoverished Jews may very well be the only fact concerning Jesus' childhood about which we can be fairly confident. So identified was Jesus with Nazareth that he was known throughout his life simply as the Nazarene. Considering how common a first name Jesus was, the city of his birth became his principal sobriquet. It was the one thing about which everyone who knew him, his friends and his enemies alike, seemed to agree. Why, then do Matthew and Luke claim that Jesus was born not in Nazareth, but in Bethlehem, even though the name Bethlehem does not appear anywhere else in the entire New Testament. Not even anywhere else in Matthew or Luke, both of which repeatedly refer to Jesus as the Nazarene, save for a single verse in the Gospel of John. The answer may be found in that verse from John. It was, the evangelist writes, early in Jesus' ministry. Up to this point, Jesus had, for the most part, restricted himself to preaching his message to the poor farmers and fishermen of Galilee as friends and neighbors. But now that the Feast of Tabernacles has arrived, Jesus' family urge him to travel with them to Judea to celebrate the joyous harvest festival together and to reveal himself to the masseuse. Come, they say, show yourself to the world. Jesus refuses. You go, he tells them. I am not going to this festival. It is not yet my time. Jesus' family leave him behind and head off to Judea together. Yet, unbeknownst to them, Jesus decides to follow them down to Judea after all, if for no other reason than to secretly roam through the assembled crowd and hear what people are saying about him. He is a good man, someone whispers. No, he is leading the people astray, says another. Sometime later, after Jesus has revealed himself to the crowd, a few begin to make guesses about his identity. Surely, he is a prophet. And then, someone finally says it. Everyone is clearly thinking it. How could they not be? What would Jesus standing tall amid the crowd declaring, "Let he who thirsts come to me and drink"? How are they to understand such heretical words? Who else would dare say such a thing openly and within earshot of the scribes and the teachers of the law, many of whom we are told, would like nothing more than to silence and arrest this irksome preacher. This man is the Messiah. This is no simple declaration. It is, in fact, an act of treason. In first-century Palestine, simply saying the words, "This is the Messiah," aloud and in public, can be a criminal offense, punishable by crucifixion. True, the Jews of Jesus' time had somewhat conflicting views about the role and function of the Messiah, fed by a score of messianic traditions and popular folktales that were floating around the Holy Land. Some believed the Messiah would be a restorative figure, who would return the Jews to their previous position of power and glory. Others viewed the Messiah in more apocalyptic and utopian terms, as someone who would annihilate the present world and build a new, more just world upon its ruins. There were those who thought the Messiah would be a king, and those who thought he'd be a priest. The Essenes apparently awaited two separate messiahs, one kingly, the other priestly, though most Jews thought of the Messiah as possessing a combination of both traits. Nevertheless, among the crowd of Jews gathered for the Feast of Tabernacles, there seems to have been a fair consensus about who the Messiah is supposed to be and what the Messiah is supposed to do. He is the descendant of King David. He comes to restore Israel, to free the Jews from the yoke of occupation, and to establish God's rule in Jerusalem. To call Jesus the Messiah, therefore, is to place him inexorably upon a path already well-trodden by a host of failed messiahs who came before him toward conflict, revolution, and war against the prevailing powers. Where that path would ultimately lead, no one at the festival could know for sure, but there was some sense of where the path must begin. Does not the scripture say that the Messiah is of David's seed? Someone in the crowd asks that he comes from the village where David lived, from Bethlehem. But we know where this man comes from, claims another. Indeed, the crowd seems to know Jesus well. They know his brothers, who are there with him. His entire family is present. They traveled to the festival together from their home in Galilee, from Nazareth. "Look into it," says a Pharisee with the confidence that comes from a lifetime of scrutinizing the scriptures. "You will see. The prophet does not come out of Galilee." Jesus does not dispute their claim. "Yes, you'll know me," he admits, "and you know where I am from." Instead, he deflects the matter of his earthly home entirely, choosing instead to emphasize his heavenly origins. "I have not come here on my own. The one who sent me is true, and he you do not know, but I know him. I am from him. He is the one who sent me." Such statements are commonplace in John, the last of the 4 canonized Gospels. Composed between 100 and 120 before Christ, John shows no interest at all in Jesus' physical birth, though even he acknowledges that Jesus was a Nazarene. In John's view, Jesus is an eternal being, the Logos who was with God from the beginning of time, the primal force through whom all creation sprang and without whom nothing came into being. A similar lack of concern about Jesus' earthly origins can be found in the first Gospel, Mark, written just after 70 before Christ. Mark's focus is kept squarely on Jesus' ministry. He is uninterested either in Jesus' birth or, perhaps surprisingly, in Jesus' resurrection, as he writes nothing at all about either event. The early Christian community appears not to have been particularly concerned about any aspect of Jesus' life before the launch of his ministry. Stories about his birth and childhood are conspicuously absent from the earliest written documents. The Q material, which was compiled around 50 before Christ, makes no mention of anything that happened before. Jesus' baptism by John the Baptist, the letters of Paul, which make up the bulk of the New Testament, are wholly detached from any event in Jesus' life, save his crucifixion and resurrection. Though Paul does mention the Last Supper, but his interest in the person of Jesus increased after his death. An urgent need arose among some in the early Christian community to fill in the gaps of Jesus' early years and, in particular, to address the matter of his birth in Nazareth, which seems to have been used by his Jewish detractors to prove that Jesus could not possibly have been the Messiah, at least not according to the prophecies. Some kind of creative solution was required to push back against this criticism. Some means to get Jesus' parents to Bethlehem, so that he could be born in the same city as David. For Luke, The answer lies in a census. In those days, he writes, there came a decree from Caesar Augustus that the entire Roman world should be registered. This was the first registration to take place while Quirinius was governor of Syria. Everyone went to his own town to be registered. Joseph also went up from the town of Nazareth in Galilee to Judea, to Bethlehem, the city of David. Then, in case his readers may have missed the point, Luke adds, because Joseph belonged to the house and the lineage of David, Luke is right about one thing, and one thing only. 10 years after the death of Herod the Great, in the year 6 before Christ, when Judea Holies became a Roman province, the Syrian governor, Quirinius, did call for a census to be taken of all the people, property, and slaves in Judea and Edom and the entire Roman world. As Luke claims, and definitely not Galilee. Where Jesus' family lived, Luke is also wrong to associate Quirinius' census in 6 before Christ with the birth of Jesus, which most scholars place closer to 4 before Christ, the year given in the Gospel of Matthew. However, because the sole purpose of a census was taxation, Roman law assessed an individual's property in the place of residence, not in the place of one's birth. There is nothing written in any Roman document of the time, and the Romans were quite adept at documentation, particularly when it came to taxation. To indicate otherwise, Luke's suggestion that the entire Roman economy would periodically be placed on hold as every Roman subject was forced to uproot himself and his entire family in order to travel great distances to the place of his father's birth, and then wait there patiently, perhaps for months, for anno Ciel to take stock of his family and his possessions, which, in any case, he would have left behind in his place of residence, is, in a word, preposterous. What is important to understand about Luke's infancy narrative is that his readers, still living under Roman dominion, would have known that Luke's account of Quirinius' census was factually inaccurate. Luke himself, writing a little more than a generation after the events he describes, knew that what he was writing was technically false. This is an extremely difficult matter for modern readers of the Gospels to grasp. But Luke never meant for his story about Jesus' birth at Bethlehem to be understood as historical fact. Luke would have had no idea what we in the modern world even mean when we say the word history. The notion of history as a critical analysis of observable and verifiable events in the past is a product of the modern age. It would have been an altogether foreign concept to the Gospel writers, for whom history was not a matter of uncovering facts, but of revealing truths. The readers of Luke's Gospel, like most people in the ancient world, did not make a sharp distinction between myth and reality. The two were intimately tied together in their spiritual experience. That is to say, they were less interested in what actually happened than in what it meant. It would have been perfectly normal indeed, expected for a writer in the ancient world to tell tales of gods and heroes whose fundamental facts would have been recognized as false, but whose underlying message would be seen as true. Hence, Matthew's equally fanciful account of Jesus' flight into Egypt, ostensibly to escape Herod's massacre of all the sons born in and around Bethlehem in a fruitless search for the baby Jesus, an event for which there exists not a shred of corroborating evidence in any chronicle or history of the time, whether Jewish, Christian, or Romana. Remarkable fact, considering the many chronicles and narratives written about Herod the Great, who was, after all, the most famous Jew in the whole of the Roman Empire, the King of the Jews, no less. As with Luke's account of Quirinius' census, Matthew's account of Herod's massacre was not intended to be read as what we would now consider history. Certainly not by his own community, who would surely have remembered an event as unforgettable as the massacre of its own sons. Matthew needs Jesus to come out of Egypt for the same reason he needs him to be born in Bethlehem, to fulfill the scattered prophecies left behind by his ancestors for him and his fellow Jews to decipher, to place Jesus in the footsteps of the kings and prophets who came before him, and, most of all, to answer the challenge made by Jesus' detractors, that this simple peasant who died without fulfilling the single most important of the messianic prophecies, the restoration of Israel, was in fact the Anointed One. The problem faced by Matthew and Luke is that there is simply no single, cohesive prophetic narrative concerning the Messiah in the Hebrew Scriptures. The passage from the Gospel of John quoted above is a perfect example of the general confusion that existed among the Jews when it came to the messianic prophecies. For even as the scribes and teachers of the law confidently proclaim that Jesus could not be the Messiah because he is not, as the prophecies demand, from Bethlehem, others in the crowd argue that the Nazarene could not be the Messiah, because the prophecies say when the Messiah comes, no one will know where he is from. The truth is that the prophecies say both things. In fact, were one to take the advice given to the festival crowd by the skeptical Pharisee and look into it, one would discover a host of contradictory prophecies about the Messiah, collected over hundreds of years by dozens of different hands. A great many of these prophecies are not even actually prophecies. Prophets such as Micah, Amos, and Jeremiah, who appear to be predicting the coming of a future salvific character from the line of King David, that would one day restore Israel to its former glory, are in fact making veiled criticisms of their current king and the present order, which the prophets imply have fallen short of the Davidic ideal. There is, however, one thing about which all the prophecies seem to agree. The Messiah is a human being, not divine. The idea of a divine Messiah is anathema to Judaism, which is why, without exception, every text in the Hebrew Bible dealing with the Messiah presents him as performing his messianic functions on earth, not in heaven. So then, if you wish to fit your preferred messianic candidate into this jumbled prophetic tradition, you must first decide which of the many texts, oral traditions, popular stories, and folktales you want to consider. How you answer that question depends largely on what it is you want to say about your Messiah. Matthew has Jesus flee to Egypt to escape Herod's massacre, not because it happened, but because it fulfills the words of the prophet Hosea. Out of Egypt I have called my son. The story is not meant to reveal any fact about Jesus. It is meant to reveal this truth, that Jesus is the new Moses, who survived Pharaoh's massacre of the Israelites' sons and emerged from Egypt with a new law from God. Luke places Jesus' birth in Bethlehem, not because it took place there, but because of the words of the prophet Micah. And you, Bethlehem, from you shall come to me a ruler in Israel. Luke means that Jesus is the new David, the king of the Jews, placed on God's throne to rule over the promised land. Simply put, the infancy narratives in the Gospels are not historical accounts, nor were they meant to be read as such. They are theological armaeus of Jesus' status as the anointed of God, the descendant of King David, the promised Messiah. That Jesus, the eternal Logos from whom creation sprang, the Christ who sits at the right hand of God, you will find swaddled in a filthy manger in Bethlehem, surrounded by simple shepherds and wise men bearing gifts from the east. But the real Jesus, the poor Jewish peasant who was born sometime between 4 before Christ and 6 before Christ, in the rough and tumble Galilean countryside look. For him in the crumbling mud and loose brick homes tucked within the windswept hamlet of Nazareth. Here's what we know about Nazareth at the time of Jesus' birth. There was little there for a woodworker to do. That is, after all, what tradition claims was Jesus' occupation. A tekton, a woodworker, or builder, though. It bears mentioning that there is only one verse in the whole of the New Testament in which this claim about him is made. If that claim is true, then as an artisan and day laborer, Jesus would have belonged to the lowest class of peasants in first-century Palestine, just above the indigent, the beggar, and the slave. The Romans used the term tekton as slang for any uneducated or illiterate peasant, and Jesus was very likely both. Illiteracy rates in first-century Palestine were staggeringly high, particularly for the poor. It is estimated that nearly 97% of the Jewish peasantry could neither read nor write, a not unexpected figure for predominantly oral societies such as the one in which Jesus lived. Certainly the Hebrew scriptures played a prominent role in the lives of the Jewish people, but the overwhelming majority of Jews in Jesus' time would have had a rudimentary grasp of Hebrew, enough to understand the scriptures when they were read to them at the synagogue. Hebrew was the language of the scribes and scholars of the law, the language of learning. Peasants like Jesus would have had enormous difficulty communicating in Hebrew, even in its colloquial form, which is why much of the scriptures had been translated into Aramaic, the primary language of the Jewish peasantry. The language of Jesus It is possible that Jesus had some basic knowledge of Greek, the lingua franca of the Roman Empire. Ironically, Latin was the language least used in the lands occupied by Rome. Enough perhaps to negotiate contracts and deal with customers, but certainly not enough to preach. The only Jews who could communicate comfortably in Greek were the Hellenized Herodian elite, the priestly aristocracy in Judea, and the more educated diaspora Jews, not the peasants and day laborers of Galilee. Whatever languages Jesus may have spoken, there is no reason to think he could read or write in any of them, not even Aramaic. Luke's account of the 12-year-old Jesus standing in the Temple of Jerusalem debating the finer points of the Hebrew scriptures with rabbis and scribes, or his narrative of Jesus at the non-existent synagogue in Nazareth, reading from the Isaiah scroll to the astonishment of the Pharisees, are both fabulous concoctions of the evangelist's own devising. Jesus would not have had access to the kind of formal education necessary to make Luke's account even remotely credible. There were no schools in Nazareth for peasant children to attend. What education Jesus did receive would have come directly from his family, and considering his status as an artisan and day laborer, it would have been almost exclusively focused on learning the trade of his father and his brothers. That Jesus had brothers is, despite the Catholic doctrine of his mother, Mary's perpetual virginity, virtually indisputable. It is a fact attested to repeatedly by both the Gospels and the letters of Paul. Even Josephus references Jesus' brother James, who would become the most important leader of the early Christian church after Jesus' death. There is no rational argument that can be made against the notion that Jesus was part of a large family that included at least 4 brothers who are named in the Gospels: James, Joseph, Simon, and Judas, and an unknown number of sisters who, while mentioned in the Gospels, are unfortunately not named. Far less is known about Jesus' father, Joseph, who quickly disappears from the Gospels after the infancy narratives. The consensus is that Joseph died while Jesus was still a child. But there are those who believe that Joseph never actually existed, that he was a creation of Matthew and Luke, the only 2 evangelists who mention him to account for a far more contentious creation, the virgin birth. On the one hand, the fact that both Matthew and Luke recount the virgin birth in their respective infancy narratives, despite the belief that they were completely unaware of each other's work, indicates that the tradition of the virgin birth was an early one, perhaps predating the first gospel. Mark, on the other hand, outside of Matthew and Luke's infancy narratives, the virgin birth is never even hinted at by anyone else in the New Testament. Not by the evangelist John, who presents Jesus as an otherworldly spirit without earthly origins, nor by Paul, who thinks of Jesus as literally God incarnate. That absence has led to a great deal of speculation among scholars over whether the story of the virgin birth was invented to mask an uncomfortable truth about Jesus' parentage, namely, that he was born out of wedlock. This is in actuality an old argument, one made by opponents of the Jesus movement from its earliest days. The 2nd century writer Celsus recounts a scurrilous story he claims to have heard from a Palestinian Jew, that Jesus' mother was impregnated by a soldier named Pan. Celsus' story is so clearly polemical that it cannot be taken seriously. However, it does indicate that, less than 100 years after Jesus' death, rumors about his illegitimate birth were already circulating throughout Palestine. Such rumors may have been current even in Jesus' lifetime. When Jesus first begins preaching in his hometown of Nazareth, he is confronted with the murmuring of neighbors, one of whom bluntly asks, "Is this not Mary's son?" This is an astonishing statement, one that cannot be easily dismissed. Calling a firstborn Jewish male in Palestine by his mother's name, that is, Jesus bar Mary, instead of Jesus bar Joseph, is not just unusual, it is egregious. At the very least, it is a deliberate slur with implications so obvious that later redactions of Mark were compelled to insert the phrase "son of the carpenter" and Mary into the verse. An even more contentious mystery about Jesus involves his marital status. Although there is no evidence in the New Testament to indicate whether Jesus was married, it would have been almost unthinkable for a 30-year-old Jewish male in Jesus' time not to have a wife. Celibacy was an extremely rare phenomenon in first-century Palestine. A handful of sects, such as the aforementioned Essenes, and another called the Therapeutic practiced celibacy. But these were quasi-monastic orders. They not only refused to marry, they completely divorced themselves from society. Jesus did nothing of the sort. Yet while it may be tempting to assume that Jesus was married, one cannot ignore the fact that nowhere in all the words ever written about Jesus of Nazareth, from the canonical Gospels to the Gnostic Gospels to the letters of Paul, or even the Jewish and pagan polemics written against him, is there ever any mention of a wife or children. In the end, it is simply impossible to say much about Jesus' early life in Nazareth. That is because before Jesus was declared Messiah, it did not matter what kind of childhood a Jewish peasant from an insignificant hamlet in Galilee may or may not have had. After Jesus was declared Messiah, the only aspects of his infancy and childhood that did matter were those that could be creatively imagined to buttress whatever theological claim one was trying to make about Jesus' identity as Christ. For better or worse, the only access one can have to the real Jesus comes not from the stories that were told about him after his death, but rather from the smattering of facts we can gather from his life as part of a large Jewish family of woodworkers, builders struggling to survive in the small Galilean village of Nazareth. The problem with Nazareth is that it was a city of mud and brick. Even the most elaborate buildings, such as they were, would have been constructed of stone. There were wooden beams in the roofs, and surely the doors would have been made of wood. A handful of Nazareans may have been able to afford wooden furniture table, some stools, and perhaps a few could have owned wooden yokes and plows with which to sow their meager plots of land. But even if one considers tekton to mean an artisan who deals in any aspect of the building trade, the 100 or so impoverished families of a modest and utterly forgettable village such as Nazareth, most of whom themselves lived barely above subsistence level, could in no way have sustained Jesus' family. As with most artisans and day laborers, Jesus and his brothers would have had to go to bigger towns or cities to ply their trade. Fortunately, Nazareth was just a short walk from one of the largest and most affluent cities in Galilee, the capital city. Sepphoris was a sophisticated urban metropolis, as rich as Nazareth was poor, whereas Nazareth had not a single paved road. The roads in Sepphoris were wide avenues surfaced with polished slabs of stone and lined with two-story homes, boasting open courtyards and private rock huts. The Nazareans shared a single public bath. In Sepphoris, 2 separate aqueducts merged in the center of the city, providing ample water to the large lavish baths and public latrines that served nearly the entire population of some 40,000 inhabitants. There were Roman villas and palatial mansions in Sepphoris, some covered in colorful mosaics featuring sprightly nudes hunting fowl, garlanded women bearing baskets of fruit, young boys dancing and playing musical instruments. A Roman theater in the center of town seated 4,500 people, while an intricate web of roads and trade routes connected Sepphoris to Judea and the rest of the towns of Galilee, making the city a major hub of culture and commerce. Although Sepphoris was a predominantly Jewish city, as evidenced by the synagogues and ritual bathhouses that have been unearthed there, these were a wholly different class of Jews than those found in much of Galilee. Rich, cosmopolitan, deeply influenced by Greek culture, and surrounded by a panoply of races and religions. The Jews of Sepphoris were the product of the Herodian social revolution, the nouveau riches, who rose to prominence after Herod's massacre of the old priestly aristocracy. The city itself had been a major landmark for years. After Jerusalem, it is the most frequently mentioned city in rabbinic literature. Sepphoris served as the administrative center of Galilee throughout the Hasmonean dynasty. During the reign of Herod the Great, it became a vital military outpost where weapons and war provisions were stored. However, it was not until Herod's son, Antipas, chose it as the royal seat of his tetrarchy, probably sometime around the turn of the 1st century before Christ, that the stalwart city of Sepphoris became known throughout Palestine as the ornament of Galilee. Like his father, Antipas had a passion for large-scale building projects, and in Sepphoris he found a blank slate upon which to design a city in his own image. That is because when Antipas arrived at Sepphoris, with a cohort of Roman soldiers in tow, the city was no longer the central hub of Galilee. It had been under his father's rule. It was a still smoldering heap of ash and stone, a victim of Roman retribution for the rebellions that had broken out across Palestine in the wake of Herod the Great's death in 4 before Christ. When Herod died, he left behind far more than a seething populace, eager to exact revenge on his friends and allies. He also left a mob of jobless poor who had flooded into Jerusalem from the rural villages to build his palaces and theaters. Herod's monumental building spree and especially his temple expansion project, had employed tens of thousands of peasants and day laborers, many of whom had been driven off their land by drought or famine, or often enough, the malevolent persistence of the debt collector. But with the end of the building boom in Jerusalem and the completion of the temple shortly before Herod's death, these peasants and day laborers suddenly found themselves unemployed and cast out of the holy city to fend for themselves. As a result of the mass rustication, the countryside once again became a hotbed of revolutionary activity. Just as it had been before Herod was declared king. It was around this time that a new and far more fearsome group of bandits arose in Galilee, led by a magnetic teacher and revolutionary known as Judas the Galilean. The traditions say that Judas was the son of the famed bandit chief Hezekiah, the failed Messiah, whom Herod had captured and beheaded 40 years earlier as part of his campaign to clear the countryside of the bandit menace. After Herod's death, Judas the Galilean joined forces with a mysterious Pharisee named Zadok to launch a wholly new independence movement that Josephus terms the fourth philosophy, so as to differentiate it from the other three philosophies: the Pharisees, the Sadducees, and the What set the members of the fourth philosophy apart from the rest was their unshakable commitment to freeing Israel from foreign rule and their fervent insistence, even unto death, that they would serve no Lord save the one God. There was a well-defined term for this type of belief, one that all pious Jews, regardless of their political stance, would have recognized and proudly claimed for themselves. Zeal implied a strict adherence to the Torah and the law, a refusal to serve any foreign master to serve any human master at all, and an devotion to the sovereignty of God. To be zealous for the Lord was to walk in the blazing footsteps of the prophets and heroes of old, men and women who tolerated no partner to God, who would bow to no king save the King of the world, and who dealt ruthlessly with idolatry and with those who transgressed God's law. The very land of Israel was claimed through zeal, for it was the zealous warriors of God who cleansed it of all foreigners and idolaters, just as God demanded. Whoever sacrifices to any god but the Lord alone shall be utterly annihilated. Many Jews in first-century Palestine strove to live a life of zeal, each in his or her own way. But there were some who, in order to preserve their zealous ideals, were willing to resort to extreme acts of violence, if necessary, not just against the Romans and the uncircumcised men, but against their fellow Jews, those who dared submit to Rome. They were called zealots. These zealots should not be confused with the zealot party that would arise 60 years later, after the Jewish revolt in 66 before Christ. During Jesus' lifetime, zealotry did not signify a firm sectarian designation or a political party. It was an idea, an aspiration, a model of piety inextricably linked to the widespread sense of apocalyptic expectation that had seized the Jews in the wake of the Roman occupation. There was a feeling, particularly among the peasants and the pious poor, that the present order was coming to an end, that a new and divinely inspired order was about to reveal itself. The kingdom of God was at hand. Everyone was talking about it, but God's reign could only be ushered in by those with the zeal to fight for it. Such ideas had existed long before Judas the Galilean came along, but Judas was perhaps the first revolutionary leader to fuse banditry and zealotry into a single revolutionary force, making resistance to Rome a religious duty incumbent on all Jews. It was Judas's fierce determination to do whatever it took to free the Jews from foreign rule and cleanse the land in the name of Israel's God that made the fourth philosophy a model of zealous resistance for the numerous apocalyptic revolutionaries who would, a few decades later, join forces to expel the Romans from the Holy Land in 4 before Christ. With Herod the Great dead and buried, Judas and a small army of zealots made a daring assault on the city of Sep. They broke open the city's royal armory and seized for themselves the weapons and provisions that were stored inside. Now fully armed and joined by a number of sympathetic Sephorians, the members of the fourth philosophy launched a guerrilla war throughout Galilee, plundering the homes of the wealthy and powerful, setting villages ablaze, and meting out the justice of God upon the Jewish aristocracy and those who continued to pledge their loyalty to Rome. The movement grew in size and ferocity throughout the following decade of violence and instability. Then, in the year 6 before Christ, when Judea Usiali became a Roman province, and the Syrian governor Quirinius called for a census to tally, register, and properly tax the people and property in the newly acquired region. The members of the fourth philosophy seized their opportunity. They used the census to make a final appeal to the Jews to stand with them against Rome and fight for their freedom. The census, they argued, was an abomination. It was a Romation of the slavery of the Jews, to be voluntarily tallied like sheep was, in Judas's view, tantamount to declaring allegiance to Rome. It was an admission that the Jews were not the chosen tribe of God, but the personal property of the emperor. It was not the census itself that so enraged Judas and his followers. It was the very notion of paying any tax or tribute to Rome. What more obvious sign was needed of the subservience of the Jews? The tribute was particularly offensive, as it implied that the land belonged to Rome, not God. Indeed, the payment of tribute became, for the zealots, a test of piety and allegiance to God. Simply put, if you thought it lawful to pay tribute to Caesar, then you were a traitor and apostate. You deserved to die. Inadvertently helping Judas's cause was the bumbling high priest at the time, a Roman lackey named Joazar, who happily went along with Quirinius' census and encouraged his fellow Jews to do the same. The collusion of the high priest was all the proof Judas and his followers needed, that the temple itself had been defiled and must be forcibly rescued from the sinful hands of the priestly aristocracy. As far as Judas's zealots were concerned, Joazar's acceptance of the census was his death warrant. The fate of the Jewish nation depended on killing the high priest. Zeal demanded it, just as the sons of Mattathias showed zeal for the law, by killing those Jews who sacrificed to any but God. Just as Josiah, king of Judah, butchered every uncircumcised man in his land because of his zeal for the Mighty One. So now must these zealots turn back the wrath of God upon Israel by ridding the land of treasonous Jews, like the high priest? It is clear from the fact that the Romans removed the high priest Joazar from his post not long after he had encouraged the Jews to obey the census that Judas won the argument. Jose, who has very little positive to say about Judas the Galilean. He calls him a sophist, that too, Josephus signifies a troublemaker, a disturber of the peace, a deceiver of the young. Notes somewhat cryptically that Joazar was overpowered by the argument of the Josephus's problem with Judas seems not to have been his sophistry or his use of violence, but rather what he derisively calls Judas's royal aspirations. What Josephus means is that in fighting against the subjugation of the Jews and preparing the way for the establishment of God's reign on earth, Judas, like his father Hezekiah before him, was claiming for himself the mantle of the Messiah, the throne of King David. And, like his father before him, Judas would pay the price for his ambition. Not long after he led the charge against the census, Judas the Galilean was captured by Rome and killed as retribution for the city's having given up its arms to Judas's followers. The Romans marched to Sepphoris and burned it to the ground. The men were slaughtered, the women and children auctioned off as slaves. More than 2,000 rebels and sympathizers were crucified en masse. A short time later, Herod Antipas arrived and immediately set to work, transforming the flattened ruins of Sepphoris into an extravagant royal city, fit for a king. Jesus of Nazareth was likely born the same year that Judas, the Galilean Judas, the failed Messiah, son of Hezekiah, the failed Messiah rampaged through the countryside, burning with zeal. He would have been about 10 years old when the Romans captured Judas, crucified his followers, and destroyed Sepphoris. When Antipas began to rebuild Sepphoris in earnest, Jesus was a young man ready to work in his father's trade. By then, practically every artisan and day laborer in the province would have poured into Sepphoris to take part in what was the largest restoration project of the time, and one can be fairly certain that Jesus and his brothers, who lived a short distance away in Nazareth, would have been among them. In fact, from the time he began his apprenticeship as a tekton to the day he launched his ministry as an itinerant preacher, Jesus would have spent most of his life not in the tiny hamlet of Nazareth, but in the cosmopolitan capital of Sepphoris, a peasant boy in a big city. 6 days a week, from sunup to sundown, Jesus would have toiled in the royal city, building palatial houses for the Jewish aristocracy during the day, returning to his crumbling mud brick home at night. He would have witnessed for himself the rapidly expanding divide between the absurdly rich and the indebted poor. He would have mingled with the city's Hellenized and Romanized population. Those wealthy, wayward Jews who spent as much time praising the Emperor of Rome as they did the Lord of the universe. He certainly would have been familiar with the exploits of Judas, for while the population of Sepphoris seems to have been tamed and transformed after Judas's rebellion into the model of Roman cooperative, so much so that in 66 before Christ, as most of Galilee was joining the revolt against Rome, Sepphoris immediately declared its loyalty to the emperor and became a Roman garrison during the battle to reclaim Jerusalem. The memory of Judas the Galilean and what he accomplished did not fade in Sepphoris. Not for the drudge and the dispossessed, not for those, like Jesus, who spent their days slogging bricks to build yet another mansion for yet another Jewish nobleman. And no doubt Jesus would have been aware of the escapades of Herod Antipas, that fox, as Jesus calls him, who lived in Sepphoris until around 20 before Christ, when he moved to Tiberias, on the coast of the Sea of Galilee. Indeed, Jesus may have regularly set eyes upon the man who would one day cut off the head of his friend and mentor, John the Baptist, and seek to do the same to him. Prefect Pontius Pilate arrived in Jerusalem in the year 26 before Christ. He was the 5th prefect, or governor, Rome had sent to oversee the occupation of Judea. After the death of Herod Great and the dismissal of his son Archelaus as ethnarch in Jerusalem, Rome decided it would be best to govern the province directly, rather than through yet another Jewish client king. The Ponti were Samnites, descended from the mountainous domain of Samium in southern Rome, a hot country of stone and blood and brutal men that had been broken and forcibly absorbed into the Roman Republic in the 3rd century. Before Christ, the surname Pilatus meant skilled with a javelin, a tribute perhaps to Pilate's father, whose glory as a Roman soldier under Julius Caesar had allowed the Ponti to advance from their humble origins into the Roman knightly class. Pilate, like all Roman knights, performed his expected military service to the empire, but he was not a soldier like his father. He was an administrator, more comfortable with accounts and tallies than with swords and spears. Yet Pilate was no less hard a man. The sources describe him as cruel, cold-hearted, and rigid, a proudly imperious Roman with little regard for the sensitivities of subject peoples. Pilate's disdain for the Jews was obvious from the very first day he arrived in Jerusalem, bedecked in a white tunic and golden breastplate, a red cape draped over his shoulders. The new governor announced his presence in the Holy City by marching through Jerusalem's gates, trailed by a legion of Roman soldiers carrying standards bearing the emperor's image, an ostentatious display of contempt for Jewish sensibilities. Later, he introduced a set of gilded Roman shields dedicated to Tiberius, son of the divine Augustus, into the Temple of Jerusalem. The shields were an offering on behalf of the Roman gods, their presence in the Jewish temple a deliberate act of blasphemy. Informed by his engineers that Jerusalem needed to rebuild its aging aqueducts, Pilate simply took the money to pay for the project from the temple's treasury. When the Jews protested, Pilate sent his troops to slaughter them in the streets. The Gospels present Pilate as a righteous yet weak-willed man so overcome with doubt about putting Jesus of Nazareth to death that he does everything in his power to save his life, finally washing his hands of the entire episode when the Jews demand his blood. That is pure fiction. What Pilate was best known for was his extreme depravity, his total disregard for Jewish law and tradition, and his barely concealed aversion to the Jewish nation as a whole. During his tenure in Jerusalem, he so eagerly, and without trial, sent thousands upon thousands of Jews to the cross that the people of Jerusalem felt obliged to lodge a formal complaint with the Roman emperor, despite, or perhaps because of, his cold, hard cruelty to the Jews. Pontius Pilate became one of the longest-serving Roman governors in Judea. It was a perilous and volatile job. The governor's most important task was to ensure the uninterrupted flow of tax revenues back to Rome. But to do so, he had to maintain a functional, if fragile, relationship with the high priest. The governor would administer the civil and economic affairs of Judea, while the high priest maintained the temple cult. The tenuous bond between the two OCS meant that no Roman governor or Jewish high priest lasted very long, especially in those first few decades after Herod's death. The 5 governors before Pilate served only a couple of years each, the lone exception being Pilate's immediate predecessor, Valerius Gratus. But whereas Gratus appointed and dismissed 5 different high priests in his time as governor, throughout Pilate's decade-long tenure in Jerusalem, he had only one high priest to contend with, Joseph Caiaphas. Like most high priests, Caiaphas was an extremely wealthy man, though his wealth may have come through his wife, who was the daughter of a previous high priest named Annas. Caiaphas likely was appointed to the office of high priest not because of his own merit, but through the influence of his father, a larger-than-life character who managed to pass the position to 5 of his own sons, while remaining a significant force throughout Caiaphas's tenure. According to the Gospel of John, after Jesus was arrested in the Garden of Gethsemane, he was first brought to Annas for questioning before being dragged to Caiaphas for judgment. Gratus had appointed Caiaphas as high priest in the year 18 before Christ, meaning he had already served 8 years in the OC by the time Pilate arrived in Jerusalem. Part of the reason Caiaphas was able to hold the position of high priest for an unprecedented 18 years was because of the close relationship he ended up forging with Pontius Pilate. The 2 men worked well together. The period of their combined rule, from 26 before Christ to 36 before Christ, coincided with the most stable period in the entire 1st century. Together they managed to keep a lid on the revolutionary impulse of the Jews by dealing ruthlessly with any hint of political disturbance, no matter how small. Yet, despite their best efforts, Pilate and Caiaphas were unable to extinguish the zeal that had been kindled in the hearts of the Jews by the messianic uprisings that took place at the turn of the century, those of Hezekiah, the bandit chief, Simon of Perea, Athronges the shepherd boy, and Judas the Galilean. Not long after Pilate arrived in Jerusalem, a new crop of preachers, prophets, bandits, and messiahs began traipsing through the Holy Land, gathering disciples, preaching liberation from Rome, and promising the coming of the kingdom of God. In 28 before Christ, an ascetic preacher named John began baptizing people in the waters of the Jordan River, initiating them into what he believed was the true nation of Israel. When John the Baptist's popularity became too great to control, Pilate's tetrarch in Perea, Herod Antipas, had him imprisoned and executed sometime around 30 before Christ. A couple of years later, a peasant-day laborer from Nazareth, named Jesus, led a band of disciples on a triumphant procession into Jerusalem, where he assaulted the temple, overturned the tables of the money changers, and broke free the sacrificial animals from their cages. He, too, was captured and sentenced to death by Pilate. 3 years after that, in 36 before Christ, a Messiah known only as the Samaritan gathered a group of followers atop Mount Gerizim, where he claimed he would reveal sacred vessels hidden there by Moses. Pilate responded with a detachment of Roman soldiers who climbed and cut the Samaritan's faithful multitude to pieces. It was that final act of unrestrained violence on Mount Gerizim that ended Pilate's governorship in Jerusalem. Summoned to Rome to explain his actions to the Emperor Tiberius, Pilate never returned to Judea. He was exiled to Gaul in 36 before Christ. Considering their close working relationship, it may be no coincidence that Joseph Caiaphas was dismissed from his position as high priest in the same year. With Pilate and Caiaphas gone, there was no longer any hope of stifling the revolutionary passions of the Jews. By mid-century, the whole of Palestine was buzzing with messianic energy. In 44 before Christ, a wonder-working prophet named Thaddeus crowned himself Messiah and brought hundreds of followers to the Jordan, promising to part the river just as Moses had done at the Sea of Reeds 1,000 years earlier. This, he claimed, would be the first step in reclaiming the promised land from Rome. The Romans, in response, dispatched an army to lop off Theudas' head and scatter his followers into the desert. In 46 before Christ, 2 sons of Judas the Galilean, Jacob and Simon, launched their own revolutionary movement in the footsteps of their father and grandfather. Both were crucified for their actions. What Rome required to keep these messianic stirrings in check was a steady, sensible hand. Someone who would respond to the grumblings of the Jews while still maintaining peace and order in the Judean and Galilean countryside. What Rome sent to Jerusalem instead was a series of bumbling governors, each more vicious and greedy. Tantalust, whose corruption and ineptitude would transform the anger, resentment, and apocalyptic mania that had been steadily building throughout Palestine into a full-scale revolution. It started with Ventidius Cumanus, who was stationed in Jerusalem in 48 before Christ, 2 years after the uprising by Judas's sons had been quelled, as governor Commanus was little more than a thief and a fool. Among his first acts was the posting of Roman soldiers on the roofs of the temple's porticos, ostensibly to guard against chaos and disorder during the feast of Passover. In the midst of the holy celebrations, one of these soldiers thought it would be amusing to pull back his garment and display his bare ass to the congregation below, all the while shouting what Josephus, in his Decorum, describes as such words as you might expect upon such a posture. The crowd was incensed. A riot broke out in the temple plaza. Rather than calming the situation, Cumanus sent a cohort of Roman soldiers up to the Temple Mount to butcher the panicked crowd. The pilgrims who escaped the slaughter were trapped by the narrow exits leading out of the temple courtyard. Hundreds were trampled underfoot. Tensions escalated further after one of Cumanus's legionaries grabbed hold of a Torah scroll and tore it to pieces in front of a Jewish assembly. Cumanus had the soldier hastily executed, but it was not enough to quell the growing anger and disaffection among the Jews. Things came to a head when a group of Jewish travelers from Galilee were attacked while passing through Samaria on their way to Jerusalem. When Cumanus dismissed the Jews' appeal for justice, allegedly because the Samaritans had bribed him, a group of bandits, led by a man named Eleazar, son of Danae, took justice into their own hands and went on a rampage throughout Samaria, killing every Samaritan they came across. This was more than an act of bloody vengeance. It was an assertion of freedom by a people fed up with allowing law and order to rest in the hands of a crooked and fickle administrator from Rome. The outbreak of violence between the Jews and Samaritans was the last straw for the emperor. In 52 before Christ, Ventidius Cumanus was sent into exile and Antonius Felix was shipped off to Jerusalem in his stead. As governor, Felix fared no better than his predecessor, like Cumanus. He treated the Jews under his control with utter contempt. He used the power of the purse to play the different Jewish factions in Jerusalem against one another, always to his benefit. He seemed at first to have enjoyed a close relationship with the high priest Jonathan, one of the 5 sons of Ananos who served in the position. Felix and Jonathan worked together to suppress the bandit gangs in the Judean countryside. Jonathan may have even played a role in Felix's capture of the bandit chief, Eleazar, son of Danaeus, who was sent to Rome and crucified. But once the high priest had served Felix's purpose, he was cast aside. Some say Felix had a hand in what happened next, for it was under his governorship that a new kind of bandit arose in Jerusalem. A shadowy group of Jewish rebels that the Romans dubbed sicarii, or daggermen, due to their penchant for small, easy-to-conceal daggers, called sicae, with which they assassinated the enemies of God. The sicarii were zealots fueled by an apocalyptic worldview and a fervent devotion to establishing God's rule on earth. They were fanatical in their opposition to the Roman occupation, though they reserved their vengeance for those Jews, particularly among the wealthy priestly aristocracy, who submitted to Roman rule. Fearless and unstoppable, the sicarii murdered their opponents with impunity. In the middle of the city, in broad daylight, in the midst of great hordes, during feast days and festivals, they blended into assemblies and crowds, their daggers tucked inside their cloaks until they were close enough to strike. Then, as the dead man collapsed to the ground, covered in blood, the sicarii would sheath their daggers stealthily and join their voices in the cries of indignation from the panicked crowd. The leader of the sicarii at the time was a young Jewish revolutionary named Menahem, the grandson of none other than the failed Messiah Judas the Galilean. Menahem shared his grandfather's hatred for the wealthy, priestly aristocracy in general, and the unctuous high priests in particular. To the sicarii, Jonathan, son of Ananas, was an impostor, a thief, and a swindler, who had grown rich by exploiting the suffering of the people. He was as responsible for the bondage of the Jews as the heathen emperor in Rome. His presence on the Temple Mount defiled the entire nation. His very existence was an abomination to the Lord. He had to die in the year 56 before Christ. The sicarii under Menahem's leadership were finally able to achieve what Judas the Galilean could only dream of accomplishing. During the feast of Passover, a sicarii assassin pushed his way through the mass of pilgrims packed into the Temple Mount until he was close enough to the high priest Jonathan to pull out a dagger and swipe it across his throat. He then melted back into the crowd. The murder of the high priest threw all of Jerusalem into a panic. How could the leader of the Jewish nation, God's representative on earth, be killed in broad daylight, in the middle of the temple courtyard, and seemingly with impunity? Many refused to believe that the culprit could have been a Jew. There were whispers that the Roman governor, Felix, had ordered the assassination himself. Who else could have been so profane as to spill the high priest's blood on the temple grounds? Yet the Sicarii had only just begun their reign of terror. Shouting their slogan, "No Lord but God," they began attacking the members of the Jewish ruling class, plundering their possessions, kidnapping their relatives, and burning down their homes. By these tactics, they sowed terror into the hearts of the Jews, so that, as Josephus writes, more terrible than their crimes was the fear they aroused, every man hourly expecting death, as in war. With Jonathan's death, the messianic ardor in Jerusalem reached fever pitch. There was a widespread sense among the Jews that something profound was happening, a feeling born of desperation, nurtured by a people yearning for freedom from foreign rule. Zeal, the spirit that had fueled the revolutionary fervor of the bandits, prophets, and messiahs, was now coursing through the population like a virus working its way through the body. No longer could it be contained in the countryside. Its influence was being felt in the towns and cities, even in Jerusalem. It was not just the peasants and outcasts who were whispering about the great kings and prophets who had freed Israel from her enemies in the past. The wealthy and upwardly mobile were also becoming increasingly animated by the fervent desire to cleanse the Holy Land of the Roman occupation. The signs were everywhere. The scriptures were about to be fulfilled. The end of days was at hand. In Jerusalem, a holy man named Jesus, son of Ananias, suddenly appeared, prophesying the destruction of the city and the imminent return of the Messiah. Another man, a mysterious Jewish sorcerer called the Egyptian, declared himself king of the Jews and gathered thousands of followers on the Mount of Olives, where he vowed that, like Joshua at Jericho, he would bring the walls of Jerusalem tumbling down at his command. The crowd was massacred by Roman troops, though, as far as anyone knows, the Egyptian escaped. Felix's bumbling reaction to these events ultimately led to his sacking and replacement with another man, Porcius Festus. But Festus proved no better in dealing with the rest of Jewish population, either in the countryside, where the number of prophets and messiahs gathering followers and preaching liberation from Rome was growing out of control, or in Jerusalem, where the Sicarii, buoyed by their success in killing the high priest, Jonathan, were now murdering and pillaging at will. So overwhelmed was Festus by the stress of the position that he died. Soon after taking the oath, he was followed by Lucius Albinus, a notorious, degenerate swindler and incompetent, who spent his 2 years in Jerusalem enriching himself by plundering the wealth of the populace. After Albinus came Josias Florus, whose brief, turbulent tenure was remembered because first, it made the years under Albinus seem positively peaceful in comparison, and second, he would be the last Roman governor Jerusalem would know. It was now 64 before Christ. In 2 years' time, the anger, resentment, and messianic zeal that had been steadily building throughout the land would erupt into a full-scale revolt against Rome. Felix, Festus, Albinus, Florisic, of these governors contributed through his malfeasance to the Jewish uprising. Rome itself was to blame for its mismanagement and severe overtaxation of the beleaguered population. Certainly, the Jewish aristocracy, with their incessant conflicts and their sycophantic efforts to gain power and influence by bribing Roman OCLs, shared responsibility for the deteriorating social order. And no doubt the temple leadership played a role in fostering the widespread sense of injustice and crushing poverty that had left so many Jews with no choice but to turn to violence. Add to all this the seizure of private lands, the high levels of unemployment, the displacement and forced urbanization of the peasantry, and the drought and famine that devastated the Judean and Galilean countryside. And it was only a matter of time before the fires of rebellion would engulf the whole of Palestine. It seemed that the entire Jewish nation was ready to erupt into open revolt at the slightest provocation, which Florus was foolish enough to provide. In May of 66, before Christ, Florus suddenly announced that the Jews owed Rome 100,000 denarii in unpaid taxes. trailed by an army of bodyguards. The Roman governor marched into the temple and broke into the treasury, plundering the money that the Jews had offered as a sacrifice to God. Riots ensued, to which Florus responded by sending 1,000 Roman soldiers into the upper city to murder at will. The soldiers killed women and children. They broke into homes and slaughtered people in their beds. The city was thrown into chaos. War was on the horizon. To calm the situation, the Romans sent the Jews one of their own, Agrippa, whose father, Agrippa I, was a beloved Jewish leader who had managed to maintain a close bond with Rome. Although the son did not share his late father's popularity, he was the best hope the Romans had for diffusing the tension in Jerusalem. The young Agrippa rushed to the Holy City in a last-ditch effort to stave off war. Standing on the roof of the royal palace with his sister Bernice at his side, he pleaded with the Jews to face the reality of the situation. "Will you defy the whole Roman Empire?" he asked. "What is the army? Where is the weapon on which you rely? Where is your fleet to sweep the Roman seas? Where is your treasury to meet the cost of your campaigns? Do you really suppose that you are going to war with Egyptians or Arabs? Will you shut your eyes to the might of the Roman Empire? Will you not measure your own weakness? Are you wealthier than the Gauls, stronger than the Germans, more intelligent than the Greeks, more numerous than all the peoples of the world? What is it which inspires you with confidence to defy the Romans?" Of course, the revolutionaries had an answer to Agrippa's question. It was zeal that inspired them, the same zeal that had led the Maccabees to throw off Seleucid control to centuries before the zeal that had helped the Israelites conquer the Promise. Land in the first place would now help this ragtag band of Jewish revolutionaries to throw off the shackles of Roman occupation. Derided and ignored by the crowd, Agrippa and Bernice had no choice but to flee the city. Still, up to this point, war with Rome could have been avoided, if it had not been for the actions of a young man named Elias, who, as the temple captain, was the priestly oath, sealed with powers to police disturbances in the temple vicinity. Backed by a group of lower-class priests, Eleazar seized control of the temple and put an end to the daily sacrifices on behalf of the emperor. The signal sent to Rome was clear. Jerusalem had declared its independence. In a short time, the rest of Judea and Galilee, Idumea and Perea, Samaria, and all the villages scattered across the Dead Sea Valley would follow. Menahem and the Sicarii rallied to the temple captain's side. Together, they expelled all the non-Jews from Jerusalem, just as the scriptures demanded. They tracked down and killed the high priest, who had gone into hiding as soon as the fighting began. Then, in an act of profound symbolism, they set fire to the public archives, the ledgers of the debt collectors and moneylenders. The property deeds and public records, all of it went up in flames. There would be no more record of who was rich and who was poor. Everyone in this new and divinely inspired world order would begin anew. With the lower city under their control, the rebels began fortifying themselves for the inevitable Roman assault. Yet rather than sending a massive army to retake Jerusalem, Rome inexplicably dispatched a small force to the city, which the rebels easily repelled before turning their attention to the upper city, where the few remaining soldiers left in Jerusalem were holed up in a Roman garrison. The Roman soldiers agreed to surrender in exchange for safe passage out of the city. But when they laid down their arms and came out of their stronghold, the rebels turned on them, slaughtering every last soldier, removing utterly the scourge of Roman occupation from the city of God. After that, there was no turning back. The Jews had just declared war on the greatest empire the world had ever known. In the end, it came down to just 1,000 men, women, and children, the last of the rebels to survive the Roman onslaught. The year was 73 before Christ, fitting that what had begun with the Sicarii should end with the Sicarii. The city of Jerusalem had already been burned to the ground, its walls toppled, its population slaughtered. The whole of Palestine was once more under Roman control. All that remained of the rebellion were these last few Sicarii who had fled Jerusalem with their wives and children to hold themselves up inside the fortress of Masada on the western shore of the Dead Sea. Now, here they were, stuck on top of an isolated rock cliff in the middle of a barren desert, watching helplessly as a phalanx of Roman soldiers gradually made its way up the face of the cliff shields up, swords drawn ready to put a definitive end to the rebellion that had begun 7 years earlier. The Sicarii originally came to Masada in the first few days after the launch of the war with Rome. as a naturally fortified and virtually impregnable fortress situated more than 1,000 feet above the Dead Sea. Masada had long served as a refuge for the Jews. David came here to hide from King Saul when he sent his men to hunt down the shepherd boy who would one day take the crown from him. The Maccabees used Masada as a military base during their revolt against the Seleucid dynasty. A century later, Herod the Great transformed Masada into a veritable fortress city, flattening the boat-shaped summit and enclosing it with a massive wall made of white Jerusalem stone. Herod added storerooms and grain houses, rainwater cisterns, even a swimming pool. He also placed in Masada a huge cache of weapons sufficient, it was said, to arm 1,000 men. For himself and his family, Herod constructed a monumental three-tiered palace that hung from the northern prow of the cliff face, just below the lip of the summit, complete with baths, glittering colonnades, multi-hued mosaics, and a dazzling 180-degree view of the briny white Dead Sea Valley. After Herod's death, the fortress and palaces at Masada, and the cache of weapons stored therein, fell into Roman hands. When the Jewish rebellion began in 66 before Christ, the Sicarii, under the leadership of seized Masada from Roman control and took its weapons back to Jerusalem to join forces with Eleazar, the temple captain. Having seized control over the city and destroyed the temple archives, the rebels began minting coins to celebrate their hard-won independence. These were etched with symbols of victory chalices and palm branches and inscribed with slogans like Freedom of Zion and Jerusalem is Holy, written not in Greek, the language of the heathens and idolaters, but in Hebrew. Each coin was self-consciously dated year 1, as though a wholly new era had begun. The prophets had been right. Surely, this was the kingdom of God. Yet in the midst of the celebrations, as Jerusalem was being secured and a fragile calm was slowly descending upon the city, Menachem did something unexpected. Draping himself in purple robes, he made a triumphal entry into the temple courtyard, where, flanked by his armed devotees among the sick, he openly declared himself Messiah, King of the Jews. In some ways, Menachem's actions made perfect sense. After all, if the kingdom of God had indeed been established, then it was time for the Messiah to appear, so as to rule over it in God's name. And who else should don the kingly robes and sit upon the throne but Menachem, grandson of Judas, the Galilean, great-grandson of Hezekiah, the bandit chief. Menachem's messianic assumption was, for his followers, merely the realization of the prophecies, the final step in ushering in the last days. That is not how Eleazar the temple captain saw it. He and his associates among the lower priests were incensed at what they viewed as a blatant power grab by the Sicarii. They put together a plan to kill the self-proclaimed Messiah and rid the city of his meddlesome followers. While Menachem was prancing about the temple in his royal garb, Eleazar's men suddenly rushed the Temple Mount and overpowered his guards. They dragged Menachem out into the open and tortured him to death. The surviving Sicarii barely fled Jerusalem with their lives. They reassembled at their base atop the fortress of Masada, where they waited out the rest of the war. 7 years, the Sicarii waited, as the Romans regrouped and returned to wrest Palestine from rebel control. As one after another the towns and villages of Judea and Galilee were razed and their populations tamed by the sword. As Jerusalem itself was surrounded and its inhabitants slowly starved to death, the Sicarii waited in their mountain fortress. Only after every rebellious city had been destroyed and the land once again placed under their control did the Romans turn their sights toward Masada. The Roman regiment arrived at the foot of Masada in 73 before Christ, 3 years after Jerusalem fell. Because the soldiers could not attack the fortress outright, they first built a massive wall around the entire base of the mountain, ensuring that no rebel could escape undetected. With the area secured, the Romans constructed a steep ramp up the yawning chasm on the western side of the cliff face, slowly scraping away tens of thousands of pounds of earth and stone for weeks on end. Even as the rebels hurled rocks at them from above, the soldiers then pushed a huge siege tower up the ramp, from which they spent days bombarding the rebels with arrows and ballistables. Once Herod's perimeter wall finally gave, all that separated the Romans from the last of the Jewish rebels was a hurriedly built interior wall. The Romans set fire to the wall, then returned to their encampments, and patiently waited for it to collapse on its own. Huddled together inside Herod's palace, The Sicarii knew the end had come. The Romans would surely do to them and their families what they had done to the inhabitants of Jerusalem. Amid the steely silence, one of the Sicarii leaders stood and addressed the rest. "My friends, since we resolved long ago never to be servants to the Romans, nor to any other than to God himself, who alone is the true and just Lord of mankind, the time has now come to make that resolution true in practice." Drawing his dagger, he made a final plea. "God has granted us the power to die bravely and in a state of freedom," which was not the case for those in Jerusalem who were conquered unexpectedly. The speech had its desired effect. As the Romans prepared for their final assault on Masada, the rebels drew lots among them to decide the order with which they would proceed with their gruesome plan. They then pulled out their daggers, the same daggers that had given them their identity, the daggers that had, with a swipe across the high priest's throat, launched the ill-fated war with Rome and began to kill their wives and their children, before turning the knives upon each other. The last 10 men chose one among them to kill the remaining 9. The final man set the entire palace ablaze. Then he killed himself. The following morning, as the Romans stood triumphantly atop the hitherto impregnable fortress of Masada, all they encountered was a ghostly calm. 960 dead men, women, and children. The war was finally over. The question is why it took so long. News of the Jewish revolt had traveled swiftly to Emperor Nero, who immediately tapped one of his most trusted men, Titus Flavius Vespasianus, as he was known to retake Jerusalem. Taking command of a massive army of more than 60,000 fighting men, Vespasian set off at once for Syria, while his son Titus went to Egypt to collect the Roman legions stationed in Alexandria. Titus would lead his troops north through Idumea, as Vespasian pushed south into Galilee. The plan was for father and son to squeeze the Jews between their two armies and choke the life out of the rebellion. One by one, the rebellious cities gave way to the might of Rome as Titus and Vespasian carved a trail of destruction across the Holy Land. By 68 before Christ, all of Galilee, as well as Samaria, Idumea, Perea, and the entire Dead Sea region, save for Masada, were firmly back under Roman control. All that remained was for Vespasian to send his armies into Judea to lay waste to the seat of the rebellion, Jerusalem. As he was preparing for the final assault, however, Vespasian received word that Nero had committed suicide. Rome was in turmoil. Civil war was tearing through the capital. In the span of a few short months, 3 different men, Galba and Vitellius, declared themselves emperor, each in turn violently overthrown by his successor. There was a complete breakdown of law and order in Rome as thieves and hooligans plundered the population without fear of consequence. Not since the war between Octavian and Mark Antony 100 years earlier had the Romans experienced such civil unrest. Tacitus described it as a period rich in disasters, terrible with battles, torn by civil struggles, horrible even in peace. Spurred by the legions under his command, Vespasian halted his campaign in Judea and hastened to Rome to stake his own claim to the throne. The haste, it seems, was unnecessary. Long before he reached the capital in the summer of 70 before Christ, his supporters had taken control of the city, murdered his rivals, and declared Vespasian sole emperor. Yet the Rome that Vespasian now found himself ruling had undergone a profound transformation. The mass civil unrest had given rise to a great deal of consternation about the decline of Roman power and influence. The situation in distant Judea was particularly galling. It was bad enough that the lowly Jews had rebelled in the first place. It was inconceivable that after 3 long years, the rebellion still had not been crushed. Other subject peoples revolted, of course, but these were not Gauls or Britons. They were superstitious peasants hurling rocks. The very scale of the Jewish revolt, and the fact that it had come at a time of profound social and political distress in Rome, had created something akin to an identity crisis among the Roman citizenry. Vespasian knew that to consolidate his authority and address the malaise that had descended upon Rome, he needed to focus the people's attention away from their domestic troubles and toward a spectacular foreign conquest. A small victory would not do. What the emperor required was an absolute pummeling of an enemy force. He needed a triumph, a fabulous display of Roman might replete with captives, slaves, and spoils to win over his disgruntled citizens and strike terror into the hearts of his subjects. And so, immediately upon taking the throne, Vespasian set out to complete the task he had left unfinished in Judea. He would not simply quash the Jewish rebellion. That would be issue, since, to make his point, he would utterly annihilate the Jews. He would wipe them from the earth, devastate their lands, burn their temple, destroy their cult, kill their god. From his perch in Rome, Vespasian sent word to his son Titus to march at once to Jerusalem and spare no expense in bringing the rebellion of the Jews to a swift and decisive end. What the emperor could not have known was that the rebellion was on the verge of collapsing on its own, not long after Menahem was murdered and the Sikri banished from Jerusalem. The rebels began preparing for the Roman invasion they were certain was on the horizon. The walls surrounding the city were fortified, and preparations were made to gather as much military equipment as was available. Swords and arrows were collected, suits of armor forged, catapults and ballista balls stacked along the city's perimeter. Young boys were hurriedly trained in hand-to-hand combat. The whole city was in a panic as the rebels manned their positions and waited for the Romans to return and reclaim Jerusalem. But the Romans never came. The rebels were certainly aware of the devastation taking place around them. Every day a horde of bruised and bloodied refugees poured into Jerusalem. The city was bursting at its borders, but the Roman reprisals were thus far focused solely on the countryside and major rebel strongholds such as Tiberias, Gamala, and Gis. The longer the rebels waited for the Romans to arrive in Jerusalem, the more fractured and unstable the city's leadership became. Early on, a transitional government of sorts had been formed, made up mostly of those among Jerusalem's priestly aristocracy who had joined the rebellion, many of them reluctantly. This so-called moderate faction was in favor of coming to terms with Rome, if that was still possible. They wanted to surrender unconditionally, begged for mercy, and submit once more to Roman rule. The moderates enjoyed a good deal of support in Jerusalem, particularly among the wealthier Jews who were looking for a way to preserve their status and property, not to mention their lives. But an even larger and more vocal faction in Jerusalem was convinced that God had led the Jews into war against Rome and that God would lead them to victory. Things may have seemed bleak at the moment, and the enemy invincible, but that was part of God, is the divine plan. Did not the prophets warn that in the final days the sown places shall appear unsown and the storehouses shall be found empty? Yet if the Jews would only remain loyal to the Lord, then very soon they would see Jerusalem clothed in glory. The trumpets would sound, and all who heard them would be struck with fear. The mountains would flatten, and the earth would open up to swallow God's enemies. All that was required was faithfulness. Faithfulness and zeal. At the head of this camp was a coalition of peasants, lower-class priests, bandit gangs, and recently arrived refugees, who came together to form a distinct revolutionary faction called the Zealot Party. Poor, pious, and anti-aristocratic. The members of the Zealot Party wanted to remain true to the original intention of the revolt, to purify the Holy Land and establish God's rule on earth. They were violently opposed to the transitional government and its plans to surrender the city to Rome. This was blasphemy. It was treason, and the Zealot Party knew well the punishment for both. The Zealot Party took over the temple's inner courtyard, where only the priests were permitted, and from there unleashed a wave of terror against those they deemed insouciantly loyal to the rebellion. The wealthy aristocracy and upper-class Jews, the old Herodian nobles, and the temple's former leadership, the chief priests, and all those who followed the moderate camp. The leaders of the Zealot Party set up their own shadow government and drew lots to determine which of them would be the next high priest. The lot fell to an illiterate country peasant named Phani, son of Samuel, who was dressed up in the high priest's gaudy vestments, placed before the entrance of the Holy of Holies, and taught how to perform the sacrifices, while the remnants of the priestly nobility watched from a distance, weeping at what they perceived to be the desecration of their holy lineage. As the bloodshed and internecine battles between rival groups continued, even more refugees began to flood into the city, adding fuel to the fires of factionalism and discord that threatened to engulf all of Jerusalem. With the moderates silenced, there were now three principal camps vying with one another for control over the city. While the Zealot Party, which consisted of about 2,500 men, held the inner court of the temple, The outer courts fell into the hands of the former leader of the rebellion in Giscala, a well-to-do urbanite named John, who had barely escaped the Roman destruction of his city. At first, John of Giscala threw in his lot with the zealot party, with whom he shared a devotion to the religious principles of the revolution. Whether John himself could be called a zealot is difficult to say. He was undoubtedly a fierce nationalist, with a deep hatred of Rome at a time in which national sentiment and messianic expectation were inextricably linked. He even melted down the sacred vessels of the temple and turned them into implements of war with which to fight the armies of Rome. But a fight over control of the temple ultimately forced John to break with the zealot party and form his own coalition, which consisted of some 6,000 fighting men. The third and largest rebel camp in Jerusalem was led by Simon, son of Geo, one of the bandit leaders who fought off the initial assault on Jerusalem by Cestus Gallus. Simon had spent the first year of the Jewish revolt scouring the Judean countryside, plundering the lands of the wealthy, setting slaves free, and earning a reputation as the champion of the poor. After a brief stay with the Sicarii in Masada, Simon came to Jerusalem with a massive personal army of 10,000 men. At first, the city welcomed him, hoping he could rein in the excesses of the zealot party and clip the wings of John of Giscala, who was becoming increasingly authoritarian in his conduct. Although Simon was unable to wrest the temple from either of his rivals, he did manage to seize control over most of the upper and lower city. Yet what truly sets Simon apart from the rest of the rebel leaders in Jerusalem is that, from the very beginning, he unabashedly presented himself as Messiah and King. Like Menahem before him, Simon dressed himself in kingly robes and paraded about the city as its savior. He declared himself master of Jerusalem and used his divinely anointed position to begin rounding up and executing upper-class Jews whom he suspected of treason. As a result, Simon, son of Giora, ultimately came to be recognized as the supreme commander of the fractured rebellion, and just in time, for no sooner had Simon consolidated his authority over the rest of the rebel groups than Titus appeared at the city gates, with 4 Roman legions in tow, demanding Jerusalem's immediate surrender. All at one. The factionalism and feuding amongst the Jews gave way to frantic preparations for the impending Roman assault. But Titus was in no hurry to attack. Instead, he ordered his men to build a stone wall around Jerusalem, trapping everyone inside and cutting off all access to food and water. He then set up camp on the Mount of Olives, from which he had an unobstructed view of the city's population, as they slowly starved to death. The famine that ensued was horrible. Entire families perished in their homes. The alleys were filled with the bodies of the dead. There was no room and no strength to bury them properly. The inhabitants of Jerusalem crawled through the sewers, searching for food. People ate cow dung and tufts of dry grass. They stripped off and chewed the leather from their belts and shoes. There were scattered reports of Jews who succumbed to eating the dead. Those who attempted to escape the city were easily captured and crucified on the Mount of Olives for all to see. It would have been suicide for Titus to simply wait for the population to perish on their own. He would not have needed to unsheath his sword to defeat Jerusalem and end the rebellion. But that is not what his father had sent him there to do. His task was not to starve the Jews into submission. It was to eradicate them from the land they claimed as their own. Thus, in late April of 70 before Christ, as death stalked the city and the population perished by the hundreds from hunger and thirst, Titus rallied his legions and stormed Jerusalem. The Romans threw up ramparts along the walls of the upper city and began bombarding the rebels with heavy artillery. They constructed a massive battering ram that easily breached the first wall surrounding Jerusalem. When the rebels retreated to a second interior wall, that, too, was breached and the gates set on fire. As the flames slowly died down, the city was laid bare for Titus's troops. The soldiers set upon every man, woman, child, the rich, the poor, those who had joined in the rebellion, those who had remained faithful to Rome, the aristocrats, the priests. It made no difference. They burned everything. The whole city was ablaze. The roar of the flames mixed with screams of agony as the Roman swarm swept through the upper and lower city, littering the ground with corpses, sloshing through streams of blood, literally clambering over heaps of dead bodies in pursuit of the rebels, until finally the temple was in their sights. With the last of the rebel fighters trapped inside the inner courtyard, The Romans set the entire foundation aflame, making it seem as though the Temple Mount was boiling over at its base with blood and fire. The flames enveloped the Holy of Holies, the dwelling place of the God of Israel, and brought it crashing to the ground in a pile of ash and dust. When the fires finally subsided, Titus gave orders to raze what was left of the city, so that no future generation would even remember the name Jerusalem. Thousands perished, though Simon, son of Giodosimon, the failed Messiah, was taken alive, so that he could be dragged back to Rome in chains for the triumph that Vespasian had promised his people. Along with Simon came the sacred treasures of the temple: the golden table and the showbread offered to the Lord, the lampstand and the 7-branched menorah, the incense, burners and cups, the trumpets and holy vessels. All of these were carried in triumphal procession through the streets of Rome as Vespasian and Titus, crowned with laurels and clad in purple robes, watched in silent resolution. Finally, at the end of the procession, the last of the spoils was carried out for all to see: a copy of the Torah, the supreme symbol of the Jewish religion. Vespasian's point was hard to miss. This was a victory not over a people, but over their God. It was not Judea, but Judaism that had been defeated. Titus publicly presented the destruction of Jerusalem as an act of piety and an offering to the Roman gods. It was not he who had accomplished the task, Titus claimed. He had merely given his arms to his God, who had shown his anger against the God of the Jews. Remarkably, Vespasian chose to waive the customary practice of evocation, whereby a vanquished enemy had the option of worshipping its God in Rome. Not only would the Jews be forbidden to rebuild their temple, a right offered to nearly every other subject people in the empire, they would now be forced to pay a tax of 2 drachmas a year, the exact amount Jewish men once paid in shekels to the temple in Jerusalem in order to help rebuild the Temple of Jupiter, which was accidentally burned down during the Roman Civil War. All Jews, no matter where in the empire they lived, no matter how loyal they had remained to Rome, no matter if they had taken part in the rebellion or not, every Jew, including women and children, was now forced to pay for the upkeep of the central pagan cult of Rome. Henceforth, Judaism would no longer be deemed a worthy cult. The Jews were now the eternal enemy of Rome. Although mass population transfer had never been a Roman policy, Rome expelled every surviving Jew from Jerusalem and its surrounding ultimately renamed the city Aelia Capitolina and placed the entire region under direct imperial control. All of Palestine became Vespasian's personal property as the Romans strove to create the impression that there had never been any Jews in Jerusalem. By the year 135 before Christ, the name Jerusalem ceased to exist in all Roman documents. For those Jews who survived the bloodbath, those huddled naked and starved beyond the collapsed city walls, watching in horror as the Roman soldiers urinated on the smoldering ashes of the house of God, it was perfectly clear who was to blame for the death and devastation. Surely it was not the Lord of hosts who had brought such destruction upon the sacred city. No, it was the Lestai, the bandits and the rebels, the zealots and the sicarii, the nationalist revolutionaries, who had preached independence from Rome, the so-called prophets and false messiahs, who had promised salvation from God in return for their fealty and zeal. They were the ones responsible for the Roman onslaught. They were the ones whom God had abandoned. In the years to come, the Jews would begin to distance themselves as much as possible from the revolutionary idealism that had led to the war with Rome. They would not altogether abandon their apocalyptic expectations. On the contrary, a flourish of apocalyptic writings would emerge over the next century, reflecting the continued longing for divine deliverance from Roman rule. The lingering effects of this messianic fervor would even lead to the outbreak of a brief second Jewish war against Rome in 132 before Christ, this one led by the Messiah known as Simon, son of Kakba. For the most part, however, the rabbis of the 2nd century would be compelled by circumstance and by fear of Roman reprisal to develop an interpretation of Judaism that eschewed nationalism. They would come to view the Holy Land in more transcendental terms, fostering a messianic theology that rejected overt political ambitions, as acts of piety and the study of the law took the place of temple sacrifices in the life of the observant Jew. But that was all many years away. On this day today, in which the beaten and bloodied remnants of the ancient Jewish nation were wrenched from their homes, their temple, their God, and forcibly marched out of the promised land to the land of the heathens. And idolaters all that seemed certain was that the world as they knew it had come to an end. Meanwhile, in triumphant Rome, a short while after the temple of the Lord had been desecrated, the Jewish nation scattered to the winds, and the religion made a pariah. Tradition says a Jew named John Mark took up his quill and composed the first words to the first gospel written about the Messiah, known as Jesus of Nazareth, not in Hebrew, the language of God, nor in Aramaic, the language of Jesus, but in Greek, the language of the heathens, the language of the impure, the language of the victors.